Right, so today we are going to be going over the story of Three Doors. I don't really have much of an intro for this one, so let's just go, yeah? The story of Three Doors is told over the course of about 30 years, and we see it through a series of letters and journal entries and notes written by a bunch of various different people over that span of time, right? And the first letter to really kick off the events of this whole thing, as well as the first letter in the series, is a letter from the Mesmer family to a director, Jeffrey August Curtin. Now, Curtin is going to be our primary antagonist for the story, along with the Mesmer family. However, he shows up more. And he is the director of the Alefkhem Royal Hospital, which is where most of this is going to be taking place, right? In the letter, the Mesmers, first of all, expressed their congratulations for his new appointment, and then they asked that he interns one of their own members into his hospital, citing monomania as the primary reason for this internment. They expressed the need for strict behavioral control therapy, which implies that he is kind of a loose cannon and should be monitored very, very closely. And then they request that he's interned for life. So basically, they want him out of the picture for good, right? And then they go on to basically give the man a bribe for keeping this troubled patient with him for essentially his entire lifetime. It's at this point that we switch our point of view to that of a Dr. Buru Kin, who is a psychiatrist at this Alefkhem Royal Hospital. Now, Kreplin's observations are split into a series of 3 dates, from June 27th to July 25th, 1900. In his first entry, Kreplin notes that Scott Mesmer first formally arrives at the hospital. He is designated patient number 17, and he is admitted without any sort of background information, no medical history, and no formal diagnosis. However, the moment that he is first admitted, he is immediately declared to be a monomaniac and put in restraints, to the point that it's noted that he can only have liquid foods due to being in restraints for the most part. Despite this, Buru kind of sees that Mesmer displays fairly normal behavior. He doesn't really display any of the traits of monomania, and aside from that, his only real quirk is that he displays a very deep interest in the affairs of the other patients of this hospital, and that he tends to keep handwritten records about them at all times. The next 2 entries in Kreplin's notes are dated July 20th and July 25th. On the 20th, it notes that Mesmer was able to somehow gather up all of the patients in the hospital and then starts a riot. And through some unknown means, he is able to induce epilepsy, crying, laughter, vomiting, all sorts of physical impairments upon these inmates. And as a result, he is then subdued and then kept separate from all the other patients in an underground guardhouse. On the 25th, Mesmer is found unresponsive in his cell, and after attempts to rouse him fail, he is taken to the emergency room, at which point he wakes up and attempts to break out, right? And then they note that as a result of this, his security is heavily ramped up. They also note that it's at this point that he begins to write on the walls of his cell in a very difficult to recognize script. Now, it's at this point that we get a testimony from the man himself, Scott Mesmer. Now, this comes in the form of a diary entry dated July 22nd, so this takes place just before his first attempted breakout of the hospital. In this entry, he first expresses contempt towards his family, which, that's fair. And then he expresses an excitement towards having a whole lot of patience and as well as an infinite amount of experimental data at his disposal, which kind of solidifies the idea that he has been kind of experimenting on the other patients as a way to further his own research. He mentions a Franz Anton Mesmer, who was actually a real person to exist in history, as well as implied to be one of the ancestors of the Mesmer line. And Scott's whole thesis rather, is that he kind of wants to validate Franz Mesmer's hypotheses that the mind of the human could be unlocked or manipulated through the use of instruments as well as Mesmer's personal magnetic flow therapy, arcanum, right? And this process he dubs as artificial somnambulism. The next entry from Mesmer that we get is about 2 months later, and it's dated September 18th. Now, this kind of showcases a very sharp decline in his living conditions, citing extremely unsanitary conditions, moldy quilts, rats, insects, all sorts of vermin present, as well as physical illness that is the result of this. Now, this is kind of due to the fact that the hospital staff is basically very afraid of him at this point. They don't really speak to him, they don't even really make eye contact with him, let alone go in to clean his cell, right? So he's basically left to stew in his own filth. The exception to this is one guard who is a bit of an old man, and he doesn't really fear Scott as much. In fact, he kind of seems to look down on him. And as a result, he doesn't really have any trouble complaining to Scott while he's on duty. To which Scott takes advantage and is able to convince the guard to reach into his cell, which he uses as an opportunity to influence him. Right, so at this point, we have a little bit of a time skip. We go from 1900 to January 1911. Now, this is a series of notes from a new nurse, Mary Hartley, who has recently joined the hospital, and her observations span from January 21st to January 26th of that year, right? At first, she expresses how amazing the job is. The prisoners are well behaved. The job requires very, very little from her personally compared to like other jobs that she has worked at. So for whatever reason, this hospital seems to be in a fairly good shape. However, she is then told to deliver a meal to a prisoner in the basement, Scott Mesmer, and is expressly told not to interact with him. Upon going down to meet him, Scott speaks to her, begging her for help. And she relates this voice as similar to the voice that her grandfather had on his deathbed, which she finds odd because the voice itself was still resounding and powerful and passionate, and she kind of describes it as a young man trapped in an old body. And the culmination of this is that Mesmer kind of gives her a letter to deliver to his family, to which she goes to speak with the director regarding the suboptimal living conditions of this particular prisoner. Upon speaking with the director, Hartley is then, first of all, berated for breaking the rules and speaking with Mesmer. And then the director kind of addresses her concerns, bringing up Dirty Hook. Now, Dirty Hook is revealed to be the old man who had basically trusted Mesmer, and we learn that he was somehow hypnotized and is still, 10 years later, still completely hysterical and must be kept shackled at all times. And this is basically enough to convince Nurse Hartley to leave the matter alone, but she does leave the letter with the director, to which, the letter is then burned. It is never actually delivered to the Mesmer family. Now, although the letter was burned, we still get to read it, right? And this is a letter from Scott to his family regarding his research. Now, the letter begins with his usual, caustic, biting remarks towards his family, which, fair, right, to be expected. Then he goes on to explain the basics of his theory behind artificial somnambulism. Right? He posits that the magnetic flow therapy plus the glass harmonica that used to belong to Franz Anton Mesmer resulted in a deep hypnotic state within the patient, which would then allow induction of the brain and the thoughts in a certain direction, manipulation of the mind, that sort of thing, right? And he basically kind of views this as the culmination of not only his own personal research and his own theories, but his ancestors' validation as well, right? He then finishes by noting that he does not feel that he has a lot of time left, and he sincerely pleads with his family that his research not go ignored. Now, Scott's prediction that he doesn't have a lot of time left is maybe a little bit inaccurate, as the next entry we get is from 1931, which is about 20 years later, right? And in this entry, which is written by Nurse Hartley, she goes to deliver food to Scott only to find that he is not responding once again, right? And she brings up her concerns with the director. However, Director Curtin states that this is just another ruse and that she doesn't really need to worry. However, 4 days later, upon still not having any response from the man, they decide, okay, something is actually wrong here, and decide to break into his room, to which they find his rotting corpse. It's teeming with insects. It is implied that while he has died fairly recently, it has still been some time. And they find that his entire room is covered in handwriting. Like the walls and everything, right? Hartley then goes to his bed and finds an exit note, right? Which implies that this termination was self-inflicted, and rather than give it to the director or anyone else, she hides it in order to, as she quote puts it, salvage his last shred of dignity. We find that Scott is then cremated, all hospital records of him are destroyed, and then Hartley goes to deliver this note that he left behind to his family. And this is basically the end of Scott's story, right? Because the man has spent the last 30 years of his life in prison, essentially, and is now gone, right? However, we still do get a entry from Director Curtin. Now, it's in this entry that we get another mention of Dirty Hook, the old man that Scott had allegedly hypnotized, and we found out that it's just a ruse. Like, for the last 20 years, Hook has been basically faking it, and this was all just an attempt to give more justification for harsher treatment of Scott himself. However, at this point, Mesmer's family goes to visit the director because they have now received his exit letter that also kind of detailed the results of his experiments, and they now want to collect the writings that he had left on the wall. So they go down, they take 2 days to record his writings within that cell, right? And then the director describes a bizarre scene. He claims he sees what is a bizarre scene in the center of the room. However, he doesn't really explain what that is. And it's at this point that the story itself comes to a close. We get a couple extra notes from the Journal of European Arcanum from 1942 and 1943. And this kind of details the rapid growth of artificial somnambulism, as well as Laplace's interest in the theory. And then in 1943, Laplace officially unveils the technology. And then, interestingly enough, the Committee for Arcanum Ethics is disbanded at around the same time. And then the Alefkhem Royal Hospital is set up for demolition at that point. And although the story ends here, we do get Scott Mesmer's last words, in which he professes, again, his undying hatred for his family. He states, "You have fabricated a non-existent hysteria, imprisoning me here and wasting the days of my life for the sake of the family's insignificant reputation." And then he goes on to say that he leaves artificial somnambulism as his legacy to the world. However, he then claims that despite his hatred of his family, he confesses that it is his mission as a member of the Mesmer family to do great things, and that is what has driven him for these last 30 years of his life. He ends the letter by saying, "I hate you all, Mesmers, and yet I am proud of my lineage. May the Mesmer family regain its glory of a century ago." So, final thoughts on the story, right? Yeah, the Mesmers are kind of messed up, huh? Though I don't know if it's just the Mesmers, right? Because this could just be indicative of many of the older, more prestigious lineages of arcanists, because we kind of get this idea that arcanists are they typically focus on one thing, right? They hyperfixate on a certain field and excel in that field because that's their thing, right? And whether that be on an individual level or a familial level is kind of variable on the whoever we're talking about. In this case, for the Mesmers, it seemed to be more a familial thing, right? The Mesmer family arcanum is this magnetic therapy that they keep talking about. And I guess it kind of gives us a bit of a glimpse on what Arcanist society, or at least Arcanist high society, might be like, where people are kind of cutthroat. They kind of maybe are less worried about the individual as much as they are the collective of their group. And I could be wrong. That could just be the Mesmer family specifically trying to regain their past glory, as Scott puts it. In terms of theory, I think maybe Scott's not actually like dead. Like, his body's clearly gone. He's been cremated. But I have a feeling that he might have left kind of like a Trojan in the program, right? Like, he might have left a fragment of himself within artificial somnambulism, just because that's kind of what he's been talking about this entire time, of separating the mind from the body, transcending the corporeal form, inducing the mind into something almost transcendental, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if he found somehow, like, in the notes he left behind, found a way to keep himself, or at least his legacy, alive through artificial somnambulism in the notes that he left on his wall, right? I don't have any evidence for that. Nothing empirical, at least. It's just kind of the vibe that I got while reading through this story. But yeah, that's pretty much my final thoughts on the matter. But with all of that being said, that's pretty much it, right? TLDR, Scott Mesmer was kept in a mental ward for the last 30 years of his life, unjustly, and during that time he came up with the theory for artificial somnambulism. So in a way, it's his fault that we have to go through limbo every 2 weeks, so you know what, blame him for that. But yeah, that's about it. Three Doors was rough, man. Like, it's all puzzles, which I'm alright with. Puzzles are fine. They still take a really long time to get through if you're, like, smooth-brained like I am. But it was a good time. It was fun. But yeah, that's it. However, before we end the video here, I would like to give a shout-out to Ayn Rand Paul Ryan for being the very, very, very first patron that I've ever had, right? I really can't express just how much that really means to me, like, how much I appreciate the fact that there are people who actually like my content and are interested enough in my content that would actually monetarily support it. That's super, super cool. Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you. But with that being said, that's everything. That's the video. Thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you again. Goodbye. I will see you next time.